What happens when America's closest ally suddenly says no? That's exactly what the world witnessed when Canada rejected a $20 billion submarine deal that Washington assumed was already in its pocket. For decades, Canada and the United States have moved in lockstep on defense projects, but this time, Ottawa drew a red line. And the consequences are reshaping not just the economy, but the future of global alliances. In Ottawa, officials stunned Washington with a single declaration: Canada would not award the massive submarine contract to American shipyards. Instead, the deal would remain entirely within Canada, fueling jobs in Halifax and Vancouver. The message was clear: Canadian workers would benefit, not American ones. This wasn't just an economic calculation. It was a statement of sovereignty. Ottawa had grown weary of being pressured into arrangements that favored Washington. By refusing to bend, Canada signaled that it was prepared to chart its own course, even at the cost of shaking its closest defense relationship. But this decision did more than surprise Washington. The fallout was immediate. Steel mills in Ohio that had ramped up to supply submarine hull plates suddenly saw their orders vanish. In Wisconsin, electronics companies producing sonar and communication systems froze their contracts overnight. In Virginia's Newport News and Connecticut's Groton, two of America's most vital submarine shipyards union leaders warned of layoffs within weeks. Workers who had been promised steady jobs and overtime hours found themselves staring at empty docks and idle machinery. The shock rippled deep into the heartland. In Pittsburgh, steel already rolled and ready for shipment sat unused. In Norfolk, welders were told to stand down. Even small subcontractors in Kansas and Missouri, supplying pumps, wiring, and precision parts, were hit just as hard. Entire communities that had believed this project would restore their economic security now faced uncertainty. And the political firestorm was only just beginning. Donald Trump had built his campaign and presidency on the promise of bringing jobs back. The submarine contract was supposed to be his proof, a deal that would show tariffs were working, protecting American workers. He toured cities like Toledo, Youngstown, and Norfolk, telling cheering crowds that billions in defense spending would revive their hometowns. But his own policies had set the stage for collapse. By slapping tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, Trump made submarine construction more expensive. Ottawa retaliated with restrictions of its own, and when Trump demanded that Canada hand over the contract, Canada refused. Critics immediately pounced, calling it proof that extreme protectionism doesn't protect, it backfires. But beyond politics, the blow struck something deeper. For decades, Canada and the U.S. had been defense partners so closely intertwined that contracts routinely crossed borders without question. Canada often outsourced large-scale projects to American shipyards, creating a steady pipeline of jobs and strengthening both nations' fleets. That precedent just shattered. For the first time in modern history, Canada chose to keep a naval project entirely at home. The symbolism was hard to miss. Canada no longer wanted to depend entirely on the United States for its security. By keeping submarine production within its own borders, Ottawa wasn't just protecting jobs, it was asserting independence. A partnership once seen as unbreakable suddenly looked fragile, and other nations were watching very closely. Allies across the globe studied Canada's decision with interest. In London, Canberra, and Tokyo, policymakers asked themselves, if Canada can say no to Washington and still remain inside NATO, why couldn't they? For decades, the United States had assumed allies would follow its lead, especially on something as strategic as submarine production. That assumption is now under question. Meanwhile, rivals seized the opportunity. Beijing saw a chance to accelerate its submarine program, while America's industrial base slowed. Moscow used the rift as propaganda, claiming NATO was crumbling under the weight of American pressure. Even emerging naval powers like Brazil and India began considering Canada's move as a model proof that smaller nations could chart their own defense path without bowing to Washington. And inside the United States, the timing couldn't be worse. Communities in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan were already struggling with inflation and high interest rates. Families had pinned their hopes on this contract, seeing it as the return of stability after decades of plant closures. Now, with the deal gone, painful memories of layoffs and economic decline came rushing back. Local governments braced for a surge in unemployment claims. Union leaders spoke bluntly without the Canadian orders. Thousands of jobs were at risk. A veteran mechanic in Norfolk put it simply, "Trump promised us mountains of jobs. Canada just pulled the plug. And we're the ones left standing on empty docks." But the economic damage was only half the story. By rejecting American shipyards, Canada wasn't just protecting jobs, it was making a long-term investment in its own defense industry. Every submarine built in Halifax or Vancouver feeds an entire ecosystem of suppliers, engineers, and researchers. Universities gain contracts for sonar and stealth technologies. Domestic tech firms expand into military innovation. Over time, Canada builds not just submarines, but a reputation as a credible defense producer, and that reputation could open global doors. Smaller European navies, or Asian partners, looking for alternatives to US-made equipment, may soon turn to Canada. What began as a refusal to comply with Washington could become tomorrow's competitive advantage, reshaping the defense marketplace. And that may tilt the balance of power in unexpected ways. Submarines are not just war machines. They're symbols of naval dominance, tools of nuclear deterrence, and guardians of critical shipping lanes. By choosing to build them domestically, Canada made more than an economic decision. It made a strategic declaration. Ottawa is carving out sovereignty in a realm long dominated by Washington. The move also changes the balance in the Arctic, where melting ice is opening new shipping routes. Canada has hinted it will expand its patrols, using these new submarines to assert control over northern waters. For Washington, that means losing not just jobs, but influence over one of the most strategically sensitive regions on Earth. And for Trump, the fallout wasn't just strategic, it was personal. The submarine deal exposed a hard truth. Protectionist policies sold as shields for American workers can become weapons against them. By slapping tariffs on Canada, Trump pushed Ottawa to pivot inward. And when Canada said no, it sent a message far louder than the collapse of a single contract. It showed that even America's closest ally no longer feels compelled to yield. The $20 billion loss is more than a line item. It's a marker of a new era, one where allies chart their own course, rivals seize opportunities, and the United States faces a sobering reality. It can no longer dictate every deal. And the question that lingers is this: if even Canada can defy Washington, who's next?